So I've talked about heritage broadly before as a thematic concern that permeates through the identities of different characters, but this time it's important to provide a more specific focus, because for Eric Killmonger, it's not just a pattern in his journey, he's a character that's only appeared in one story, so the concept of heritage is deeply concentrated into his connection with the main narrative's central theme. At the heart of Black Panther is a debate about globalization and the conflict that comes from what is forgotten and what is recognized in terms of preserving a national continuity in an ever-changing and smaller world.
The world's gonna start over, and this time we're on top.
Eric and T'Challa are figures that inherit great political powers, and in doing so, represent two sides of the same debate. So the purpose of this essay is to examine how Eric's journey embodies its argument and how it then feeds back into his personal story. So good times, yo.
Your heart is so full of hatred. You are not fit to be a king.
Eric Killmonger represents an anti-heritage argument, where collective remembering is seen as a top-down process, because it's understood as an expression of institutional powers.
How do you think your ancestors got these? You think they paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?
As Patrick Wright argued, heritage innately frames the past unfairly because it's projecting imagined ideas of identity back into the past, or hauling them out of the past and using them to delegitimize aspects of present life. Consequently, this is the very reason why T'Chaka kills N'Jabu and just leaves Eric in America.
We had to maintain the lie.
It's an attempt to preserve his own legacy in an unchallenged way. And what makes this particularly sad is Black Panther opens with Eric's father enculturing him with his national heritage.
And we still hide Baba?
Yes.
This is a story that doesn't just externally explain the world to Eric, but also internally provides him context. A national identity that is connected to a culture and to an imagined community. And one of the most subtle features of this introduction is that Eric asks his father to tell the story again.
Tell me a story.
Which one?
The story of home.
This is not new information, this is him wanting to hear out a fantasy of home that is fetishized and idealized.
As Wakanda thrived, the world around it descended further into chaos.
And this is one of the big questions in academia, the ethics of this process, because the narrative here is deeply shaped by nostalgia and a process of selectivity. In order to paint a perfect national image of Wakanda, it's leaving out the presence and narratives of people from the outside world. And ironically, in the story we're actually watching, this includes Eric and his father. The world of the storytellers are ignored by their own story. This contradiction also establishes Eric Killmonger's obsessions with narratives, and specifically those that are forgotten by them.
For real?
Which is anchored with the museum scene, where the expert gets the history wrong, and just before she seemingly gets diarrhea from the coffee, Eric takes the opportunity to rub it in her face that he has something that she doesn't.
I beg your pardon.
It was taken by British soldiers in Benin, but it's from Wakanda, and it's made out of vibranium.
The displacement of knowledge is a point of conflict. As a result, Eric Killmonger may be the antagonist of the story, but he's not the villain. Instead, T'Chaka is structurally the villain.
You were wrong to abandon him. I chose my people.
Because his decision to reduce the complexity of the past in order to present a sanitized version of it is what ruined Eric's life and trapped T'Challa in a cycle of ignorance.
I accept your challenge.
T'Challa represents an argument more akin to Raphael Samuel, who argued that there's a false binary between history and heritage, because there's often an unavoidable democratic dimension to cultural remembering, like the way local museums commemorate local histories and are led by small communities as opposed to big national or corporate entities.
It is for all of us.
Oh, us.
Us, you are the first king to come here in centuries, and now you speak of us.
In other words, who we remember and how we remember the past should be understood as a negotiation rather than a conflict because it's less reductive.
He's a monster of our own making.
These values are embodied by T'Challa, who's not only had contact with the outside world, but he's in love with Nakia, who champions the outside world. And he also helped Bucky.
Thank you.
He's an honorable hero because it's not about the narrative, but people. And his position of political power is about accommodating the value of life.
We let the fear of our discovery stop us from doing what is right.
Where Eric Killmonger casually shoots his girlfriend because his mission and his narrative of revenge comes first, T'Challa doesn't kill M'Baku, and he even goes out of his way to bring Martin Freeman back to Wakanda.
Right.
T'Challa is pro-heritage because he's a king that is subject to the social pressures of those underneath him. Now, academically speaking, scholars like Patrick Wright and Raphael Samuel were mainly talking about the ethics of tourism and museums when it comes to heritage, but they're still relevant to my exploration because the war for Wakanda's future is dependent on seeing which philosophy wins out. Either a top-down perspective which views heritage as an expression of power and conflict.
It's about 2 billion people all over the world that looks like us. Wakanda has the tools to liberate them all.
Or a bottom-up model that argues that it can and should be more democratic, metropolitan, and responsible.
We all know the truth. More connects us than separates us.
In the end, Eric loses because his plan has no future. When T'Challa entered the ancestral plane, he saw his father in the Wakandan sunset amongst other Black Panthers, but when Eric enters, he only goes into a tiny apartment in Oakland with his father.
No tears for me?
Where T'Challa is embraced by his, Eric gets a regretful look from N'Jabu.
Well, maybe your home's the ones that's lost. That's why they can't find us.
Eric's limited connection with the past is what caused him to kill so many people, but the tragedy of that violence is that it's deeply sincere, so it doesn't exempt himself. His death is a decision, and once again an act of power that repeats history as opposed to breaking it. Eric, just like his father, fought for a revolution and he lost before it could ever begin. This entire top-down position that obsesses over the concept of power is presented as a manifestation of Eric's trauma, and by doing so highlights that an unwillingness to let go of old narratives in order to produce new ones means the inability to recognize the self as an author. Therefore, it's only inevitable that whatever identity is created will become a victim of its own dismissal. There's a great quote by Corner and Harvey: "People's accounts of their lives and culture don't simply speak for themselves, they require interpretation and understanding." And heritage offers just this because it provides symbolic continuity that stabilizes our sense of identity. But within the age of the modern, this has become a more uncertain process because there's a need for reconstruction to make the old world work with the new. Because globalization is marked by the compression of space and time, which makes the world feel so much smaller.
I gave you a key, hoping that you might see it someday. The sunsets there are the most beautiful in the world, but I fear you still may not be welcome.
Eric's father wanted to pass on something better for his son, strong convictions and an empathy for those ignored. Because N'Jabu wanted Eric to be a member of the global community, not just an American citizen or a Wakandan.
To think I saw you as some crazy American.
But N'Jabu's view of this connection is one of violence.
With vibranium weapons, they could overthrow every country and Wakanda could rule them all the right way.
And that ultimately condemns his son. Eric is traumatized by the death of his father. His entire life lost its future because he could no longer imagine one. All Eric had was a nostalgic connection to a fairy tale that came and murdered his father. Therefore, the only continuity that's left is the sole logic of violence, power, and vengeance against an idea. Wakanda is not a place but an abstract concept in his mind.
My pop said Wakanda was the most beautiful thing you ever seen. He promised he was gonna show it to me one day. You believe that? Kid from Oakland running around believing in fairy tales.
The what if that robbed him of what is, so all he wants to do in life is to make his personal what should be into what will.
They'll arm oppressed people all over the world so they can finally rise up and kill those in power and their children.
If the wider story is about international reconstruction from globalization, then Eric functions as a warning. If Wakanda doesn't escape from its own nostalgia, then it will be destroyed by more Erics, either from the outside or from within, as Wakabi shows. And the solution isn't to protect the continuity of the past, but to allow it to compete and develop into a more holistic image in the present, where the embarrassing secrets from obscured memories can have a useful place in the future. Eric Killmonger is one of the most popular MCU characters, despite appearing only in one story, and it's not hard to understand why. He presents difficult questions about the ethics of memory, heritage, trauma, and identity. These are themes that surround us and connects every one of us with where we live and where we're from. And the sad thing about Eric is that Wakanda was never home for him, but just merely an idea. One that consumed him.
Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me. Nah, I'm your king.